Yep, right there. Hold my finger on it and get her spotted down good on two ends. I'm just going to throw this joker up here. Come here. Alright. You can just drive yourself crazy trying to do this, y'all. It's like, don't struggle with it. Just, weld on, just weld on some temporary fixtures. Don't let this thing drive you nuts, because it will. I can tell you, it will. We're on exactly 6 degrees. Hey folks, Jason here with Dirt Race Life. If you've been following our street stock build, you can see I've jumped ahead and put this whole right side assembly together. Well, there's a method to my madness. In this episode, I want us to talk about the geometry and roll center stuff and all of that and the parts that we used. But then before the episode's over, we'll put the left side together as well, because I'm going to show you how I go about figuring out how do you mount this tower and get all of this right. So, good episode here. A lot of maybe controversial ideas. Definitely want to stick around. No beating around the bush on this episode. Straight to the good stuff. Let's talk about the parts I'm using on this metric frame. This lower control arm, this is Rodney Wings of Crate Racing Street Stock approved. Lower control arm, it's a tubular assembly that has been modeled. This one is modeled on the Nova, so it's 1 inch wider than what a stock metric lower control arm is. And like these things have got like serial numbers where they're logged, where that like they can take, and the Crate Racing tech could actually make sure that this is a serial numbered one that was bought and approved for Crate Racing. So when y'all see this tubular, you can't just run any tubular in Crate Racing. It has to be one on their approved list. IMCA's kind of got some stuff like that, like only certain aftermarket things. So that's the lower, but it's the same as what a Nova would be. This spindle right here, this is the spindle that was on my crush. It's not just because I had it. I was given some very good information to run the Camaro style spindle, which is the same as a 73-77 mid-size frame spindle on the metric to get the type of performance that I'm after. So that's what this spindle is right here. Both sides. It's going to be on the lower control arms, same deal. I'm running the Nova on both sides for the lower control arms. On the spindle, I'm running the Camaro spindle on both sides for this. On the upper control arm, I have got a 8.5 inch right side upper control arm. I am running an 11 inch left side upper control arm. Now these are the really good Joes, and I do have the slugs in, so the Joes itself has got slugs on the back where that you can slide it for caster, and then also these upper tower mounts that Jamie Lewis sponsored us, they have the cutouts for the Joe slugs in them as well, where that you can raise and lower the entire height of the upper control arm, and you can also set anti or pro dive by putting 2 different slugs in these. All right, on the ball joints, we're running the Chrysler style ball joints, top and bottom. We are running plus a ½ inch on the lower ball joint. We are running plus 1 inch on the upper ball joint. This is not my setup. I'm not going to take credit for this setup. This setup is like what Jamie Lewis and I talked about. It is also a setup that I had several front-running Ultimate Street Stock Series racers that, when I was asking, like, I'm going to build a metric car, do you have any advice for me on what would build, a good front-end setup? And I am definitely not being misled, because over and over, I was getting the same information. Use Rodney Wings or a Nova style lower control arm right here. Go with the Chrysler balls. Go with a ½ inch on the lower. Go with plus 1 on the upper. Use the Camaro spindle. Like the only place that the racers seemed to be, differing was which upper control arm to use as far as the brand and the length of it. And, like there were some differences in people's ideas about anti-dive, and as far as the height and parallel or angled. So there were some differences, but, here at Dirt Race Life, we've gained enough momentum and we've been to enough races and stuff where we've got a lot of supporters, and there's a lot of guys that are front-running racers, and they want to see, you know, stuff out on YouTube that helps put more cars on the field. I've been getting some good information. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you right up front knowing that we were going to put some of this out here and being okay with that to help the sport. Now that we know what parts we used on this right front, like, what does that actually mean? Well, I spent about an hour earlier today, and I mapped out like all of the movements of this right front. Come on. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the camber and caster and like how it maps. And when I say map, like as the you know, lower control arm compresses up into the frame, what it actually does. All right. So here we go. So we started out, we set our tower with that 8.5 inch upper control arm. We set 6 degrees of negative camber on that right front. And at 6 degrees of negative camber, we had 5 degrees of positive caster. That's what I set. So I positioned the tower and the slug in it and everything to set 5 degrees of positive caster. And then I turned around and I bumped up 1 inch. So I went up, so that's like -1 inch on ride height, like on that right front. This was measured at where the shock will be, all right? So that's our point of measurement, was like where that lower shock mount would be. That's where we measured at. Okay, so on camber, I went on camber to 7.9. All right, so almost a 2 degree gain in that first inch. And then turn around, and on caster, I went to plus 4.75. So I lost a 1/4 degree of caster. Important point. This is with the upper mounts mounted parallel, so they're straight in line with the frame. They're not matched up to the lower. Okay, so a 1/4 degree was lost in that first inch. Then I turned around and at 2, so when I bumped up 2 inches, or compressed in 2 inches, the 7.9 turned into 9.8. So it's very consistent. So 1.9 degrees of camber gain, or camber loss. I guess it would be gain, going negative more. But anyway, 1.9 degrees right here, and then 1.9 degrees again when I went that 2nd inch. On the caster went to 4.6 degrees. The best, you know, I don't have needle marks and it's a bubble, so, you know, it's not like the digital, but best I could tell, about 4.6 degrees. So I'm continuing to have a slight loss in caster. Now, when I was compressed 3 inches at the shock mount location, that 9.8 turned into negative 11.5. And so that was 1.7 degrees of change in 1 inch. And my caster was 4.5. The huge piece of information that should be gained from this immediately, that 1/2 degree of caster change, so like over 3 inches of compression, I only lost a 1/2 degree of caster. By far, a parallel setup on your upper towers, the way to go. There is not an issue with caster gain and loss that is anywhere near an amount to be concerned with. I mean, that's a 1/2 degree over 3 inches. I would not have an issue with a 1/2 degree over 1 inch. So I definitely have no problem with, you know, all of my chassis in the future. I've always done the parallel setup where that my 2 towers are pointing straight, you know, front to back with the car, in alignment with the car. They're not turned with the lower control arm angles, like where those bolts go through. And I've always done this because it seemed like that it made the setup on the car a lot simpler to understand, and all of the numbers worked, and it was better for bump steer and the whole 9 yards. Well, when you actually start measuring, there's a reason for that. And so in your mind, you want to think that because that lower control arm is on an angle, that as it goes up and down, it's moving that bottom of that spindle, you know, forward and back. And so if your upper mount is, you know, on a different angle, and it's moving up and down in this different plane, like the two aren't in the same plane and all this convoluted, complicated stuff, that's like making that whole spindle like mess up the caster and stuff. Nope, not a problem. Don't even worry about it anymore. There's your numbers. We can move on from that and not even talk about it anymore. Okay, so let's talk about the camber right here. I'm gonna be honest with you. That's a little more camber gain than I wanted right there. I was told 8.5. I had a few people saying 8 3/4. Some were 8.5. Some were 8 1/4 on the upper control arm. And you know, everybody is wanting camber gain because the idea is that as the car rolls over, then the tire is leaning in more and more and more to keep that tire planted into the dirt. And I agree with that. But that's nearly 2 degrees an inch. Is the car actually turning over 2 degrees for every inch that the right front compresses? No, and I have no intentions of my car doing that. I mean, well, there's some IMCA stock cars that the left rear looks like that it is like taking off for the moon. Maybe they're going 2 degrees per inch of the body rolling over. But for me, we're wanting a very stable chassis that just sits down on the front and tucks in and turns through the corner. And we just stay in this turn the whole way around the track. I'm going with this. I will just reserve that if you see me go to like an 8 3/4 or a 9 inch, you know, during the year, it's going to probably come all the way back to this and me possibly learning that, okay, I'm getting too much camber into my tire. I'm wearing on the inside tread. But I don't think I just need to arbitrarily like change the right front now. I need to see what it does, see the wear on the tire, because we think we're going to be somewhere around this 2 inches. We think we're going to run a 1/2 inch low, okay? So we're going to, our ride height, we're going to tuck that right front down, maybe a 1/2 inch, and then we're probably going to compress 1.5 inches, no more. We're going to run bigger, heavier springs, and we're going to try to like have the right front lower to start with and then just pull it down 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches. Should never see that number. So let's go with this, see what it does. If we see too much wear on the inside of the tire, not enough on the outside, then we'll do something about it. Okay, now let's talk about this as far as roll center goes. You know what you want your tires to do on the car when it like goes through a turn and stuff. And then from that, you're figuring out like what parts and pieces to put on the car. And then because you know what parts are on the car, you can figure out like what those lines are that you would like draw out on a board and stuff. And then that tells you where your roll center was out. But okay, you know where your roll center is at, but you don't want to move it. Like if you want to move it, it's like you really are just wanting to like change one of those parts out in order to make a tire act different. And so at the end of the day, like building these street stocks and stuff, it's not actually being aware of where your roll center is. It is being aware of what your tire on the left front and the right front are doing on your car, and knowing how to modify that per side, because it's independent suspension each side, to get that tire to do what you want, which is stay hooked up in the track at all times. Under throttle, under brake, stay hooked up in the track, be able to turn the car anytime you want to. That's all you're after. And so like the idea of you figuring out where the roll center is doesn't actually help that happen. It just adds a lot of math and a lot of confusion, and it kind of makes it like a dark art that makes you feel like that you're missing something. Well, I got news for you. You're not. There's nothing there. And I'm going to prove it to you. Here's why. So like, let's just take an example of a racer who calls me and we're talking about a problem with the right front tire. All right. So I'm going to draw a right front tire right here. All right. Got a big old chassis over here. All right. So this is the car over here. Here's this right front. And they're saying, hey, I'm struggling to turn the car through the middle of the turn. I apply throttle and it's just a little bit throttle tight, but it's great. Everything else is great. but it's a little throttle tight. And I say, well, go look at the right front tire for me. So they go and they look at the right front tire, and I say, where's the wear at? And they're like, oh, I always chew the outside edge off of my right front tire. And I said, really? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, how much camber you got? And they're like, well, you know, I got 5 degrees of camber, negative 5 degrees of camber. And I'm like, you do? And I'm like, well, okay. I'm like, that's decent. You know, that's decent camber. That should work, right? And so then we'll start talking about like ride heights and where it's at. And so I'll ask him, I'll say, well, you know, like, where's your ride height at? And they'll be like, well, I run my ride height, you know, fairly low. I like it low. And so I've got it down fairly low. I run a big tall tire, and you know, they'll tell me, I'll say, well, measure it. And they'll say, well, that lower control arm, it's up 1 inch, you know, out here, you know, at the wheel. I'm up 1 inch. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot. And they're like, yeah, I know. I'm like, I'm up like that on both sides and everything. And I'm like, okay. And so they're up 1 inch over here, you know, and I'll exaggerate this a little more for effect. You know, so they got this angle running right here, and then I'll be like, well, what about the upper right there? And they're like, well, you know, I'm pretty well flat, you know, so like they're sitting here on that stock mount, and they're pretty well flat, and so they got this stock lower and this stock upper right here, and you know, they're talking about this wear, and I'm like, well, okay, that really doesn't add up for you to have all that wear. And then I start drawing it on paper, and I start looking at it, and they're giving me the numbers, and I'm like, huh. Well, actually, what you've got is you've got a problem here with your camber loss. And they're like, really, camber loss? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, you're washing your tire out in compression is what you're doing. You're running this real low ride height. And they're like, but the car's great. I don't want to change the ride height. It's got good drive. I got, you know, I like how the car, you know, is sitting, how it drives, how it handles and everything. I'm like, well, okay. I'm like, well, there's things we can do. You know, let's change just out here at the wheel itself, so that this thing will get some camber gain instead of camber loss, you know, and fix the problem without changing anything else on the car. And they're like, hey, I'm all ears. Tell me about it. And I'm like, well, let's put a plus 1 inch ball joint in that lower, all right? And this is just an example, but let's put a plus 1 inch ball joint in that lower, and let's get that lower down here, you know, level, all right? Let's get that leveled out right there. I'm like, okay. And I was like, let's go ahead and put a plus 1 inch in this upper right here. And let's get that upper arm up. Let's get some angle in that upper arm right there. And they're like, okay. And so now all of a sudden, this curve for this lower right here, and this curve right here represents the movement of the spindle, like the bottom of the spindle. As it goes through this curve, the bottom of the spindle is moving in here, and as it goes out, you know, out through the middle, and as it comes in, it's moving in, and then the same deal. This is the curve of the upper right here, and so as this goes up, it's moving in. Well, by me taking and spreading this out like this right here, what we've done is we've taken, and now this spindle that was, as it compressed, it was pushing out at the top. Now all of a sudden, as this spindle compresses and goes up, now it's pushing in at the top. And so now instead of maybe our 5 degree was washing out to like 4 degrees or 3.5 degrees, now all of a sudden the 5 is turning into 6. It's turning into 6.5. And so now we got a little bit of camber gain going on. Guess what? Car suddenly starts getting better. Car starts working. He didn't have to actually change his ride heights. He did have to change. He had to change his spring right here. He had to shim, you know, turn a cup on it to get it all to scale out again correct. But otherwise, it still works. The car still drives the same. He's got the exact same wedge in the car front to rear that he had. But what did he actually do right here? He moved his roll center. That's what he did. But think about it along these lines. Like, we knew where the problem was, and we were trying to address the problem. And yes, us changing these parts did move the roll center, but it was just along for the ride. It was just this mathematical location that actually wasn't a part of the conversation because it didn't need to be. I know we're not all going to agree on this approach, but just keep in mind, this is us trying to figure out a way that people coming into the sport, people that are struggling with it, How can you understand making the changes that are going to make your car get better, that are going to get you into the winner's circle without feeling like you've got to be some kind of rocket scientist? And I'm here to tell you, you don't have to be an engineer. You do not have to be a rocket scientist. You can just focus on those parts that actually make the tires work better, and it is going to improve your race car. Let's do the fun stuff. Now again, we're using a +1/2 inch ball joint on the bottom. Spindle lower, same on both sides. And let's get this thing all together, and we're going to figure out how to do this deal. And don't let me forget, before this video is over, I want to cover anti-dive, pro-dive, and the height of where we're actually at in relationship to this plate right here. I want to show y'all something different about this left upper control arm right here. So this Joe's 11 inch, you'll see it's marked there 20 degrees. Well, if you'll look, this front is turned down 20 degrees on the nose right here. And the reason for that is because where it bolts up into the tower is a lot lower on the left side to create a lot steeper angle. Well, that angle is so steep that you take and you put some angle here on the end, that way your ball joint doesn't bind. There's a reason for all of this. It really does make sense. It's some slick parts. Lets you get your setup really tuned into what you need. But let's get it all together, and then we can kind of talk about that a little bit more. On this tower right here, I'm going to put these slugs in. I'm going to put a 0 on the front. I'm going to put a 1/2 inch high on the back. So I'm going to actually put some Pro Dive in this left front. All right, so what we've got to do here is we've got to hold this tower up here in place long enough that we can see where we need to be as far as front to back with the tower to set the camber where we want it. Now, if I set the towers very close to the same on both sides, they don't have to be the same on both sides, y'all. There's no requirement. It is an independent front suspension. But if they were the same, I would put a 3/4 space in it right there. And I use it as a guide on the other side. I want to use that as a guide on this side if I can. But like with it up against the jack bolt right there, it's going to be very close to the same. And so if I pulled that against that right there, and I use my third arm, known as a belly right there, and if I slap my angle finder on right there, and I hold my mouth just right, I can look. So we know the camber number we want. I can put a 3/4 inch piece of steel back here as a guide when I weld it on, and I can set the camber and then slide it forward or back to figure out what the caster is. But I've got a problem. I'm on a 0 Joe slug right here in my slot on the front. I want to be as low down on that front as I can. I'd like to put a little bit of Pro Dive in this car if possible on this left front. And I am touching the frame and actually holding this tower up off of this flat by probably a 1/16 of an inch. That's okay. I'm just going to take and mark, and I'm going to do just a little bit of clearancing. I'm going to clearance this because I want to be able to put that caster wherever I want it and be happy with it. So I'm going to mark that. I'm going to do a little bit of clearancing there. That way I can put it where I want it, and I'm going to mount this tube parallel where we can clamp onto it and use it as a guide to set the tower and measure caster. First thing I've got to do though, I've got to deal with that corner right there. It needs some room. All right, so we got our clearance we need in it now. And the next thing I'm going to do is put the guide on it. Like I said, I'm just using a piece of 3/4 inch steel right here. And I'm going to spot weld that down. That way I can clamp to it, get everything right, and then weld up the actual tower itself. But the problem is I have to get this parallel with the car. So, and get the angle of it right. So the way I do it is really simple. I just take a long level and I lay it up here, and that way I've got something big that I can measure against my jig in my frame and get this in line with the car, and then I can take a steel ruler and I can set this piece, and that's all I do. So I'm going to take and I'm going to clamp this thing down in a couple of places, maybe some zip ties on it where it can't move. get it all squared up, and then we can measure to that. Get this clamp off here. Get you out the way. And let's see if this all starts working. You sit up here, right there, right? Got this jack sitting this at ride height. Okay. I'm just gonna take and so I don't really know where the caster's at, so I just have to throw it up there and get a measurement is really all I can do. So like I've got it in a spot, right? And then I just have to take and see where it's at. Pretty much all I can do. See where you're at and then go from there. So we know the camber's right. We'll check it. Let's see what the camber did up. Let me see. Let me get her to 90 because that's where I'm gonna weld it at. It's 90. Oh yeah, about 4.5 degrees camber. Let's see where we're at on the caster. Out. So still too much caster, so we're gonna come forward a little more. I'm gonna keep coming forward until I nail it. I got her 3 degrees of caster, 4 degrees of positive camber. I'm locking this heifer in. So I'm just going to put a few spots right quick and then unbolt everything. Alright, so I got my lower control arm level across and I'm just going to check. So like right here, I'm at 4 degrees. Positive camber sitting at 0, like in other words ball joint and the bolts cross are level at each other. If I bump up, so compression an inch, so let me push an inch into it. If I push an inch into it, I go from 4 down to about 2 1/4. All right, so because I'm gonna have a little bit of compression happen on this left front, like initially on entry, I'm gonna get a little bit of compression. You know, that's gonna happen. I'm gonna float through the center and get some compression. All right, so we're back to ride height at 4. So when I drop an inch, I'm out to like 5.5. It looks like I've got 1.5 degrees of camber gain per inch of travel down. Really nice. So I'm liking how that works. I've got all of this. Oh, anti-dive. I want to talk about that. So anti-dive, pro dive. Let's talk about that for just a second. On this left front, I have got pro dive in this left front. I'm on a 0 slug in the front and I'm a 1/2 inch up in the back. And that measures 5.5 degrees pro dive. Maybe too much, but that's where I'm going to start out at, 5.5 degrees. I may get a 1/4 slug too, where I can change that around and like cut that in half if I want to. But as far as like actually how high I am off that plate, your numbers, this back bolt is 2 3/8 off of the top of this plate. And if you watched where we put the plates on, you know how I did that. And then the front bolt, I am 1 1/8 inch up off of the front of the plate here. All right, that's on the left front, and that's creating 5.5 degrees of pro dive. All right, let me cover the right side right quick, and then we'll talk about the difference. All right, so on this right side, I'm up 1/2 inch on both the front and the back all together, and that gives me 0. Okay, so I'm 0. I'm no anti, I'm not pro, I'm just 0 on the right side, and a half an inch up on these. On the front is 2 1/8, and on the back is 2 7/8. Okay, so like I said, check out the video where I put the plates in, where I went under it in the front, on top of it on the back. You can recreate this exact scenario right here. I've never run Pro Dive before. I am being told Pro Dive on the left front can be an advantage, and the reason being is if you're running a stiffer spring on the left front, that initial phase where you're in the second half of the straightaway and you apply some brake and bring the nose of the car down, it's going to help to pull the left front down for you. So it's going to pull the left front down. It's going to help set you up. And then by the time that you actually go into the entry of the turn, you're off the brake and you're going to start transferring weight across. So Pro Dive on the left front can be helpful. I'm not saying we'll keep it. We get out here and run this car. I'll have the extra slugs. We'll change it around. I may be able to learn when it's needed and when it's not. Well, that wraps up this episode. Let's see, next episode on the street stock build, we're going to do these bay bars that are going to come down through here. We're actually going to cut the tops of these towers off, but we're going to use the shocks and figure out where the shock needs to be, and that's going to actually set where our bay bars are. And then we're going to do some reinforcement and some structure back in here. I don't know. We'll figure it all out together when we do that episode. So make sure you're subscribed and you've got your notifications on, and I will see you then.